The Chicago Digital Accessibility and Inclusive Design Meetup presents Software Developer Kits and Accessibility with Thomas Logan.
Thank you. So, hello everyone. All right. That video made me a bit emotional too. I hadn't actually seen that video yet, but I had known that Apple started their keynote this year with a sequence of videos, and it was really exciting to me to see the CEO of the world's most powerful corporation, the richest corporation, starting off their presentation talking about accessibility. It does really speak to the fact that we are at a time where change is happening. I started working in accessibility in 2001. I was a computer science student in North Carolina, Chapel Hill. So Michael Jordan here in Chicago. I'm a big fan. So I started in computer science, and I worked with a blind student in the classics department. And he was working with ancient world maps, which are inherently visual. And so that was my first exposure to thinking about accessibility as someone new to computer science. Like, wow, this is actually something where with technology, we can make information accessible to someone else. So my project at that time was, how do we make a map, explored through touch and sound? And that's what got me interested, in this whole world of accessibility. Right after that, I actually got a job at Microsoft. And so speaking tonight about accessibility software developer kits, it's kind of close to me because it's kind of full circle for me. That's really the first corporate job that I had in accessibility, was working on a software developer kit. I worked on Microsoft UI automation, which is a way to make software applications accessible on the Windows platform. And it's funny for me just to go back in time and look at me coming out of college. Really just, I've only worked with this one student that was in the computer science department, learned from the experience of that project. And then there I was working on a software developer kit, at that time, one of the largest companies, really trying to understand, well, what are the things that need to be in a software developer kit for accessibility? So tonight, it's really, I'm kind of highlighting a lot of the different things that I've seen in the current software developer kits. It's coming from both a point of view of, let's look at what's really interesting and great in each one of these kits, but also sort of a bit of, let's look at the big picture of, why does each software developer kit need to have each of these unique things? I'm kind of coming from a viewpoint now, working as long as I have in this field, that we really do better, working collaboratively and working together. So part of my viewpoint, even talking about these kits, is how can we sort of bring these together? Like, why do we need to think of making an application accessible on Android as something, kind of very different from making it accessible on iOS or on Microsoft? So a couple other things. I'm Tech Thomas on Twitter. I'm not as prolific as Dennis on Twitter, but I try to be. And I also I have a company, Equal Entry. So my whole career at this point is working on making technology accessible. Oops. Right as I say that, my Chrome crashes. That's good. That's a different kind of accessibility. So tonight, I'm a big person. I do a lot of presentations, so I'm very much into, like, what are my 3 key takeaways? I'm going to start with them and end with them. My first key takeaway is, I think accessibility software kits should strive for more consistency between implementations. I think it's not doing a service to accessibility to have these concepts that are all, in theory, exactly the same concepts be expressed different ways on each platform. And I'm someone that's like looking at virtual reality now as like, okay, my partner actually works on a virtual reality platform. I'm like, I don't want virtual reality to be something that we're waiting like 5 years after people start working in these new experiences to make it accessible. So I'm already thinking, from that viewpoint, like, let's learn from everything that's been done already in the software developer kits, and as new technologies continue to come out, try to make these things more consistent. Second is, I think, accessibility software kits, software developer kits. When we make them, we should have at least one real example demonstration of how to properly use the functionality in it. So I've worked with the W3C. I've worked on the Accessible Rich Internet Application specification. I've read a lot of the specifications. Frequently, you know, for me, I'm always thinking, wow, we always document these API calls, things that developers should do. We don't exactly explain end-to-end how it would work. Like the video that we watched at the very beginning tonight, it's very powerful. You know, we're seeing things happening. I guess that was Final Cut Pro, or it was iMovie, it was Final Cut Pro. Okay, so right, like, it's very interesting, like if you can connect the experience of like, what did the developer do and the Apple SDK to make that functionality work for using the head switch, you know, that allowed that movie to be created. A lot of times when we look at the documentation for the developer kits, they don't actually connect the experience end to end. So that's something I'm very passionate about. That's a lot of the work that I do at Equal Entry. I do a lot of work with SSB Bark Group. Erica Zelminowitz is here from them, but I've worked a lot on creating these demonstration videos of here's what actually happens if you implement the work. And so I think that's something that software developer kits should do more of. And even when looking at what Apple just showed there, that could already be like a follow-up of, okay, so how did that actually work? What needed to happen to make Final Cut Pro work that way so that she could create that awesome video? And then lastly, I think software developer kits need to demonstrate more accessibility implementations throughout. So, you know, worked in this field a long time, building up a sample as someone that doesn't work for Apple or work for Google, you know, I really, or anyone working in this field, we only have so much time to build sample code to show people how to make something to be accessible. It's much better, and what I've been trying to do more lately is look at what's already shipped by Google or Apple or Microsoft and say, well, how do we implement your accessibility API in the samples that you're teaching developers how to use? So what I'll be demonstrating today is most of them have like one sample, at least each SDK will have an accessibility sample that shows you, here's how you implement our API. But unfortunately, all the rest of the samples, which could have implemented the API and been further evidence for developers of how to implement accessibility, they're just missing that work. So if I was a developer learning from a different part of the SDK and I download that sample, I'm like grabbing something and starting from something that doesn't have accessibility built into it. So my point of view is we should be advocating, or if we're working in a place where we can make that change, let's put more accessibility implementations into every developer sample we put out, because a lot of developers work by cutting and pasting. You know, at least I work that way. And so that's something that, you know, if people are cutting and pasting accessible solutions, now they already have those attributes in their code. They already know that kind of needs to be there. If it's not in the sample code they're cutting and pasting from, there's no real push for them to add that in. They have to actually go that extra step and download the accessibility SDK. So those are my three main points. And then the rest of my presentation today is really a whole bunch of demos, which is dangerous, you know, so we'll see how far. Yeah, it's brave. We'll see how far each of those goes, but we'll basically start with Apple. So, you know, I think it's great that we started with the Apple presentation. I really think Apple has just done so much to demonstrate, you know, really going above and beyond. The one that I usually show that was in that video is using the camera and actually hearing that someone's face is in the viewfinder. You know, that's not something legally required from Section 508 or WCAG 2.0 or all the jargon that if you work in the accessibility industry that we see, that there's no mandate to add that to like a consumer product. But Apple doing that, you know, it's such a powerful thing. Like, who doesn't want to take a photo of their family or like share that on social media? So that's a really good example. It was cool to see that in there, that I do think Apple's done a lot to really go beyond and just do more. And that's what I think all companies should be doing. It's definitely paid off for Apple with the loyalty of consumers really flocking to their platform. All right, so let's start. Actually, I forgot. All right, my first thing that I'm talking about, this is just one example. I could have picked a million different examples of APIs, but let's start with the most basic. images need to have a text alternative. You know, if you started in the very earliest days of Web 1.0, the image tag had an alt attribute, and we would tell developers every image needs to have an alt attribute, and you need to fill that out. You know, it's 2016. You can still find and scan most websites where that's not being done perfectly correctly. But you know, you look at that, that's HTML. We're calling that concept that an image needs a text alternative, an alt attribute. All right, these are 3 more examples just to show you how dramatically different APIs refer to that same base concept. Like we're saying, let's give a description, let's give a label to something that's not text on the page. Microsoft has a property called UI automation, or has a platform called UI automation, and their property is called the name property field. So if you're working on Windows and you're building an application that needs to provide a text alternative for an image, you would need to go into your code and set automation element.name property equals the description of the image. If you are on Android, and you're building an Android mobile application, Android has called this exact same concept a content description. So Android has a whole bunch of, you know, well-meaning and well-written information of how to add a content description to an image that's put on an Android phone. Conceptually, it's exactly the same thing. We're giving a text description of an image, but, you know, from a thought process or for a developer, we're making this harder. It's the exact same thing that needs to be done for accessibility, but because we call it something dramatically different, we don't really let people transfer that knowledge as easily between platforms. And the longer you work in technology, the more you cycle through these platforms, you just sort of start getting frustrated. Why do I need to relearn some of these concepts? And now accessibility is a base concept. So Android has a lot of great information. So just calling out here, this page pretty well built out, lots of different information of how to properly add the content description. And then the last one is iOS. They call their property the accessibility label. So this would be if I'm building a iOS application and I put an image in the iOS application, I would need to go look and set accessibility label to provide that information. Now, if I was hosting a web view inside of my iOS application, I might need to set aria-label because I'm building a rich internet application. So maybe that's a little bit closer, you know, accessibility label and aria label. But on Android, then that means you're setting content description and then you're setting aria-label, all for the exact same concept. So I just picked that as one. You know, we could go into a million other properties, setting roles, states, values. These are all part of web content accessibility guidelines. They're all expressed usually differently on each platform. So just multiply this one property times all the things we want developers to do correctly. You can see we're adding a lot of complexity. So I think that's my first key takeaway. If we could get, you know, as a group to either one, work more collaboratively. You know, it's very hard to work from consensus. So I've only worked for about a year with the W3C because I realized, you know, that getting consensus is very difficult. But I do think that's something we should advocate for as a group of people working in technology, is the more consensus there is on these concepts, the easier it'll be for someone to implement them. And, you know, I think about property like a border or a margin or an outline. Those properties are pretty much referred very similarly across technology platforms. It's more when we get into things that have, like accessibility, that hasn't had as much of a pattern practice to it. All right, so that's the first point. Back. All right, so then the next one is, now I'm just going to look at 3 platforms just with the time we have, try to do a bunch of demos, but show you what is currently available and hopefully teach you some neat things that are on each platform. The first one for Apple, we'll start with Apple. They have a whole portal page for their developers. It's an accessibility portal page. We can read about accessibility on iOS. We can see lots of different areas. It's very nicely designed. We can go to captioning and audio descriptions, how to use VoiceOver, and then we have a bunch of developer resources that they link to. And so they do a great job of all of the videos from their different annual conferences for developers that they did a topic on accessibility are available, at least going back to 2012. So if you are interested, just from this development link, you can already watch some pretty high quality multimedia content of Apple developers or product managers teaching you how to do accessibility correctly. You can also go into the UI accessibility protocol, which this is the main way that we implement accessibility in an Apple iPhone iOS application. And so again, this is pretty well documented. One of the concepts that I call out is that we could go and read about these different properties, and each one has a pretty good written description, but not necessarily that end-to-end visual description I was talking about. Like, I think it would be cool that somewhere in one of these properties, the functionality that we saw in the Final Cut video, it would actually say, you know, for example, if you want to understand how this trait or this property works in practice, like this is how it worked in Final Cut. So I'm going to click on traits just to call this one out as a place to look. These are a bunch of different traits that you can set in their accessibility API, and maybe some of them we read and we say, okay, I know what that should sound like when assistive technologies interact with it, like UI accessibility trait selected. Okay, yeah, if I have a selection state in my application, I want to express that an element is selected, and probably if VoiceOver, the screen reader on that platform, reads it, it'll read out to the user that that element's selected. But there's other ones like UI accessibility trait updates frequently. Like I read this one and it says, okay, this element updates very frequently. If the label or value too often to send update notifications, include this trait when you want an assistive application to avoid handling continual notifications and instead poll for changes when it needs updated information. For example, you might use this trait to characterize the readout of a stopwatch. So, okay, you could use the timer stopwatch app on the iOS platform, but I still don't really know what's the correct behavior. Like, what does VoiceOver do now that I've set that property? Does it just read every minute? It polls it and reads it out. It's kind of hard to know exactly if I did start using this in my own application, what's it supposed to do? So I think that's the barrier we have in a lot of APIs, is we don't actually explain the other side of it. We tell developers, set these traits, but what is the assistive technology supposed to do with that information, you know, when they consume it? And I know we can't prescribe and set every single case of how they should use it, but I think something more representative of an end-to-end sample, that it really shows, well, with the stopwatch, VoiceOver does this. That would really help illustrate the principle more. So that's the UI accessibility traits. I do call out here the two really good examples that Apple has built for developers. There's custom content accessibility, and then hello, goodbye. So I'm going to try to hook up my iPhone now to show you guys hello, goodbye. And this is just another example where it's more just taking the documentation further. Maybe, you know, some of us in the room, you may have never seen this example, but you would actually benefit from knowing what are the things that it actually shows me how to implement. So right now, the Apple expectation is we download the SDK. We can download the sample code, load it into Xcode, build it on our phone. But hopefully what I'll be able to show is just demonstrate what it's trying to show you that's good for accessibility. All right, so here's a free tip. If you run, if you have an Apple platform, you can actually turn on Quicktime, select your iPhone, and that's a really cheap and free way to display what your iPhone is displaying to a room or for a presentation. So on this, I have downloaded Hello Goodbye. And so one of the things that Hello Goodbye was implemented, so it was like, I think I like this, it's pretty fully built out sample. So one of the other points I said is, you know, if I was building a sample for iOS to teach you accessibility concepts, maybe mine wouldn't look quite as nice, wouldn't be as realistic. So they're trying to build like a Tinder clone or an OkCupid clone, you know, online dating. So they took like a pretty realistic app that lots of developers are trying to build, and they put accessibility implementations into it. So some of the things that it does is on on your profile page, showing you how. Turn this on. Oh, I just oops.
Adjustable.
So in this one, it's showing you how to use
one finger to adjust the value.
Using the adjustable trait. So adjustable trait is for like a slider or something that can have a number go up and down. This is showing, okay, I'm setting how old I am by actually doing the slide up and slide down.
38, 39, 40, 41, 42, 40, 40, 39, 38.
I don't know if I want to tell you guys how old I am, but we will, this is an example of, all right, sliders, not something that is always really clearly understood. How do you make that accessible? A lot of apps that don't follow this pattern, they're not accessible. Like they don't actually have the slide up and down to adjust it. So for a screen reader, they don't have a way to get to that and navigate it. So this sample, that was one of the ideas to build accessibility.
Hello, goodbye. Hello, hello, matches. Matches, matches. Hello, goodbye. Back button, matches. Swipe up to say hello. Swipe down to say goodbye.
So this one is showing actually, you know, visually displaying instructions of like, it's like the swipe right or swipe left from Tinder, I think. But this is swipe up and swipe down, hello and goodbye.
Cooking. Bubble tea, copy, 38. Profile photo. Image.
How do you navigate through that?
Actions available.
So this one with VoiceOver, it's swipe right to go to the next element, swipe left to go to the previous element. And what this example was showing is we have a somewhat rich UI. You know, it's not as rich as probably what we see in the apps, but it shows that we have a label for the photo. We can
32.
We can move sequentially through the content.
Cooking. Bubble tea with friends. Travel.
And this one is actually. Oh. You know, one way that people frequently make mistakes with accessibility is it might read age, hobbies, then 32, then cooking, bubble tea with friends, travel. That's hard to understand. So this was to show the proper implementation that it actually reads age, then it reads 32, it reads hobbies, then it reads cooking, bubble. So again, a lot of those things you have to learn through actually going through the sample code and building it out. But having that also illustrated in the SDK, you know, where people don't have to go and download and build it. Maybe a product manager, a program manager, or a designer just wants to know the right behavior of these traits. They've already built this example, but right now it's kind of a little bit walled off that you have to download, build it, and play around with it to illustrate these.
Select VoiceOver off.
The other things that are interesting with this sample, so I think these are exciting sort of features that are coming and they're enabled on mobile platforms, but developers do have a way to detect if people are running different accessibility features on the iPhone. So this sample lets you see that, for example, if I select bold text, this is actually going to reboot my phone a little bit, but when you use bold text on your phone, it makes applications that support that have a stronger contrast. It's easier to see. So this application, it might be a little hard to see without seeing side by side, but it actually swaps out a bold font when the user sets that. So without that setting on, it's a little lower contrast, and maybe for some designers or design scenarios you don't want to have a bold font. But this app is showing that you can actually have two different presentations. You can detect if a user has that bold setting set on their phone, and then you can re-render the application that way. The only other one I was going to call out here, because I kind of react to this one quite a bit, is animation, right, is becoming more back on trend in putting into interfaces. And so there is, oh, I have that actually set on right now, but you can reduce the motion of the user interface. So this app actually illustrates how to use or properly detect reduced motion. So the application, if I turn off reduce motion, again, a little hard to see without doing this side by side, but you know when we're dismissing people that we either like them or don't like them, this animation happens much faster when reduce motion is turned off. So for someone that actually has maybe a type of disability where motion is either distracting or could be vestibular disorder, this app shows you that if you set that setting, you can actually decrease the animation and make it slower, make it less jarring. All right. All right, so that is basically, that was an app that they built, right, that was really good. Like, that's the one that they tell people, let's go build an accessible app, let's implement it. So now this is me kind of calling out Apple a little bit, that you go and get a different app from their SDK. They build an, excuse me, an app for displaying a periodic table of elements. And they built that app more to train developers how to, let's see. It's showing you a model view controller. We're having, how to do configuring and responding to selections in a tab bar, displaying information in a table view, using navigation controllers. There's like a whole bunch of things they're teaching you how to do in their in their API. The problem is they're not actually implementing accessibility in the sample. So if the developer hadn't downloaded that hello goodbye sample, but they were interested in learning these concepts from the element sample, it doesn't have that implemented. So I'm just going to show that. All right, so I made two. So I've like fixed one, and this is the default one that comes in the API. So the default one, some of the critiques of what's being taught here is that this application, when we spin it around and when we view information about the periodic table of the elements, the contrast of the text. So depending on the ones that we select, the contrast for like the link to view the hyperlink out there, it's not very good. And so, we could say, well, that's not the point of showing this sample, but it is, if we actually want people to always be building accessible apps, even just having, a sample that lots of people are learning from that doesn't illustrate that concept, is problematic. Another one is if I turn on VoiceOver.
View with Wikipedia.
Like
View with Wikipedia.
I'm going to swipe left and right.
Button. Back button. Button. View with Wikipedia. Button.
So on this screen, like all we hear is back button, button, and view at Wikipedia. So, the actual information, the information about the atomic weight, what elements being displayed, none of that information is exposed in this sample. So again, if I was building like a card view, you could put anything into like, maybe you're like,
alert, accessibility.
when I saw it, I'm like, that is a kind of a slick animation to turn the card on and over. But if someone just took this card, added their own information into it, it's already built, not implementing accessibility. So I'm just going to show, because we don't have time to go, fully into all of these. This was one where turn off the contrast too. So darken colors, if you didn't know, darken colors is how we set a high contrast theme on the iPhone. So kind of another point for me, most platforms call that high contrast theme. High contrast is somewhere in the language. In the language of iPhone, it's actually called darken colors. And it really does potentially give that same possibility for a developer to say, oh, if someone has darkened colors on, I'm going to present a high contrast theme. But that's like really taking a leap of understanding of accessibility to really get there, that's what this means. So I'm going to turn that one off just for right now.
Voiceover on A11Y, the elements, back button, americium, atomic weight, 243, state, artificial, period, 7, group, 3, discovered, 1944A, D.
So in this concept, I'm showing you
Element summary.
that's actually a,
Elements.
sorry, I hate
A11, A11.
to really nail down giving a live presentation and having a screen reader talking, it's quite a juxtaposition, you know. But so one of the things I'm trying to illustrate that is in every API is you don't ever want each one of those pieces of text to be like separate navigable elements. One of the basic principles is trying to group together information. So all the APIs, they'll have documentation sort of explaining that concept. And I saw this one as like a perfect example of there's really no benefit, at least in this scenario, to be making one swipe right go to the period, one swipe right go to the group, one swipe right go to discovered. We can group that information together and make it just one hit target or one selection state. So again, it's just looking at all of the different samples that Apple's built. That was sort of my thought process when I had to work on how do I show people in my trainings to make an accessible app rather than build my own app. I took the Apple SDK for the periodic table of elements and just added those techniques in. But that's something I am planning to report back to Apple, hopefully incorporate. I'd really like, you know, more and more samples to have those illustrative points. All right, so now off of Apple, switching to Android. Let's talk about some good things in Android. First, you know, Android has very complete accessibility SDK. One of the things that I think is the most interesting with Android is they have actually, they have a bunch of different ways to view and interpret the information, but on their developer screen, they actually have you know, way more documentation, step-by-step of things that you should do. And then they even have a course that they've built that's like a step-by-step course for people to follow on at home. So rather than only having a video or only having an SDK, they have an iterative sample where you follow along and you build out the sample as you go. So you download it, you make these changes, and then you keep working with it, and they tell you if you're doing things right or wrong. So I do think, you know, documentation, if anyone here in the room does work on the documentation team, that's something that I think Android and Google is probably doing the most for trying to document more interactive code samples. They've also done a lot of video training. So on Udacity, which is also something that Google works a lot with, Google has a really extensive web accessibility course that's available for free. And that's something that, you know, I think really supports the work that they've been doing on Android. So here's the app, or sorry, the training. So you can see they have 13 different modules. This is the codelabs.developer.google, and this is basic Android accessibility. you can really step through this at your own pace. And again, it has all of the different types of steps that you would expect from a accessibility training. They tell you how to download the code. You start off working in Android Studio. There's steps for enabling TalkBack. So they've done a lot, you know, on that side to make it more than just download an SDK sample. So I think those are all good things to applaud. All right, so the basic accessibility. All right, I'm going to try something here to switch to the other. The password for the Wi-Fi here was. Anyone remember that? Thank you. Good memory. All right, so on the Android, at least I don't know, it's something as fast as using QuickTime to display your phone. So I use a paid client called Reflector. Reflector needs you to be on the same Wi-Fi network to work. We'll see if this will work.
Wi-Fi?
Oh, no, we got it.
Oh,
Sorry.
you got it?
Yeah,
Okay.
we
You came back. Sorry. Never mind.
All right. Well, just to keep it moving, because this is live, I did record this prior to coming. That's another pro tip. It's always good to record it before you go. Right, finding it. Well, it should be in something labeled Accessibility Chicago. Have a good label, and this is basically, I think the thing I want to call out that I thought was a little bit of a negative here is that, so Android sample that you download from their SDK, that if you compare that to what Apple did, this isn't a real app. And this is probably more what I think I traditionally see in accessibility samples, where of course there's value in teaching us the techniques, but it's not as illustrative for a developer end to end, especially if you look at, again, going back to the first video that was shown, you know, you really see the impact, like, why did I implement accessibility? Like, that person was now able to, like, edit a video, and this is how it all connects. I mean, it's nothing wrong with building a sample like this, but it's just not as exciting or illustrative of why accessibility is important. So you step through and you set different information that's available in the API, but you can't actually really see end to end why that was important because it's not a real application. And then the last thing that I'll call out that's just another ding to me for Android is that you know, there are a lot of conventions that have been built up for accessibility APIs, and one of the most important ones I think is that accessible labels or accessible names, you know, they need to get associated with controls, and that's something that in the documentation, at least for how you set up like this custom dial, they're just using the label custom view, but also you'll notice TalkBack, this is TalkBack showing what it's reading. It doesn't actually associate the label with the dial. So from even in the accessibility sample, it doesn't really follow the conventions of what would normally be in an accessibility sample. And part of my question is that might be because the people don't work in a large enough group of comparing work across the different platforms. There might be other reasons of why that's implemented that way in Android, but it's not explained, you know, and it's for someone that works in accessibility quite a lot. It's like a noticeable difference in the way that their API doesn't have the ability to do that versus the other APIs. And I will say another thing that I think is really good, and this is funny because now I don't have to actually have the screen reader reading out, but saying discard buttons, the Android has a way to display what the speech synthesizer is speaking in its view. VoiceOver running on iOS does not. So if you're working collaboratively with a developer or you want to show them a bug, it's much easier to have this visual display. Like this one is trying to show us, hey, it's stuttering. It's saying discard button button. A screen reader just needs to hear discard button. I can actually take a screenshot, using Android's TalkBack because it does have the visual display. And if I'm working with someone, a developer, to show them the problem, it's easier to communicate the problem on this platform because we have that visual display of what the screen reader is speaking. All right. Yeah. Perfect. So why not transition to Microsoft? Save the best or worst for last, depending on your opinions of each of these companies. Microsoft, again, doing great job on accessibility. I started, when I did start working accessibility, I was really excited to work for Microsoft because they actually had an accessibility team. So if you go back to 2002, when I graduated, it was not something like it is today where people had these accessibility groups that you could go and work in. So, for a long time, Microsoft has been committed to working on an accessibility and making progress there. So just want to show that they also have a developer portal. So all of the three main, technology platform companies that I see, they all have these developer portals for accessibility. Microsoft is also more heavily focused on video training, video illustrations of how to do things. And they similarly have sample code that you can download, different things that you can do to play around with accessibility. And I'll just call out the example I showed of Apple, of having SDK samples that aren't accessible. Those apply for Android and Microsoft too. The majority of the samples don't have accessibility built into them. So unless you go to their developer accessibility portal and download the accessibility sample, you don't learn the techniques. The thing that I wanted to demonstrate, and I learned this very recently, how many people have used Microsoft Edge in the room? 1, 2, 3, 4. So yeah, smaller percentage. So Edge is, what's Microsoft's trying to shift to for their new browser, for their new web experience. So one of the things, I'll just boot Parallels quickly, but Edge has a cool feature for viewing the accessibility tree. And I guess I just wanted to make sure I showed at least one good thing from each of these three companies. And this is pretty cool. Like, the accessibility tree has always been, if you work in accessibility, visualizing the accessibility tree, making sure accessible elements, that there's not too many in the tree. That's always a part of all the different platforms, but they don't make it easy to see the tree. In Microsoft Edge, you can actually pull up the developer tools, and the accessibility tree is available from this accessibility icon. That will let you navigate through the tree of elements and see the different elements that are in the tree. So I can see that there's hyperlinks in my presentation. I can see that there are headings in my presentation. I can see there's an element marked description, which is what, because we have the highlighting, we can see that Microsoft Edge maps the block quote element to a description element in UI automation. So this is something very important. This is really talking about web accessibility. I was talking about mobile accessibility before, but if you look at Safari running on the Mac, or you look at Google Chrome running on Mac or Windows, they don't have a way to easily visualize this tree. You have to download other tools. And so again, I think this is great to see Microsoft's building that into the browser. It's making it more present for developers that need to do this work. Like, why make someone download another tool to do accessibility? So let's look at that as a great example that hopefully gets emulated in the other browsers, because if you've done a lot of work on developing accessibility, the tree is like a very important concept on any platform for making it accessible. So to wrap up, go back to my, let's get back here. No, I don't need to, but I'll just use them from memory. You know, the 3 points I was talking about here are that we need to have more of a robust set of developer examples for accessibility. So ideally, every developer sample in an SDK has accessibility built in. We should have more implementations for anything we put into an accessibility SDK. We should show how it works end to end. So we should make it really clear what the benefits are, why is a developer doing that, and what's it supposed to work like with an assistive technology. And then lastly, we should have more consistent naming. We should not make it confusing that, you know, we're giving a text alternative for an image, having totally different names on each platform. You know, that's more difficult. Those are my 3 points. I'd like to wrap up. Thank you for the attention, and then have some Q&A here at the end, just for my section. Thank you.
What I'll do is, as people have questions, I'll actually hand you the mic, so we don't have to repeat. Anyone have any questions?
So I was surprised. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the presentation. It's excellent. I was surprised to know that Microsoft has been working on accessibility for so long. Why is it that Apple seems to be the winner in seeing the perception of an accessible platform versus other platforms?
Well, one thing that I do think is very interesting, that at least I can share from the Microsoft experience I had, was that, you know, if we look at just the screen reader perspective, so the people with vision impairments, Narrator, the screen reader that's built into the Windows platform, had never been advertised by Microsoft as a screen reader replacement. And so I think that's been a big difficulty for them that they're now, you know, addressing, because Apple does build in a screen reader that works fully. You know, really you can't install other screen readers on the iPhone, for example. So Apple was able to get that to work much more consistently. So that's, I mean, that's one simple example, but I think that's something Microsoft still needs to continue working on, is that Narrator, which is the screen reader they ship on their platform, needs to be a full-featured screen reader. It should be able to fully implement it. So that's one. And then I think it's really just taking on mobile. I think it's really just the end-to-end, making interfaces simpler, easier to use. That's something that I even look at the accessibility SDK from Microsoft. It's got a lot more options in it, but it was trying to support a lot more functionality that's available on the desktop. And so mobile, I think you could still say Apple's not necessarily as great on the desktop for accessibility as Microsoft is, but on mobile, Apple did so much more. And also to ding Microsoft on the Windows Phone, you know, that shipped without accessibility. That's a huge embarrassment. You know, that's not, no new technology should ship without an accessibility implementation. And so Apple's shown with the watch and the TV that they're really committed. And so they've really, I think, won that argument that no one should be releasing new products that don't have accessibility built in. So the other companies should follow and do that.
You showed a lot of things where you're working with, you know, UI controls and things like that. How do you do things like this if you're working with, say, OpenGL for a game or something like that? Are there ways you can still utilize the operating system's kind of built-in features?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, I think that's a little bit where I was going with talking about the virtual reality stuff, that, you know, unfortunately, there's not like these primitives or elements. Like if I look at Unity and building like a application in that interface, they do have the elements and objects we could add properties on. I think in OpenGL, you actually would have to build almost like that structure yourself. I don't think there is like the higher level tree or like set of elements that you can add those objects onto. But I mean, that's something I don't actually know a ton about the OpenGL development space, but there should be. I mean, I think that's the point. Like any developer environment, so I just pick on Unity because it's the one I'm the most familiar with. There should be a way in Unity to set accessibility attributes and add that information. It shouldn't be all on developers to have to build up underlying backend I do think that that's most the way games have been made accessible in the past, is that people build up just like a structure that maps to the game, and almost like it's hidden behind the game, and they've had to, basically just rebuild the whole interface from scratch.
We have time for one more question. Yeah. There's one more.
Well, if we're talking about preaching the gospel of accessibility, what do you think needs to be done? Developers usually think of accessibility as something rather secondary.
Mhm.
What would move it up the hierarchy?
Lots of different ideas. I guess one idea that I think is a community, making sure that we either file bugs or add on to bugs that have been filed. I mean, I know that a lot of companies, they have people that work for their company, but if people aren't presenting it as a problem or logging things as a problem, then they don't have anything to go to their executive team or management team to say, hey, this is a problem. So definitely one is that I think if you are working in a capacity where you find bugs, like you log them onto people that are responsible. I think the other one is just making sure that, if you are building components, UI libraries, that if you really make your library very accessible, advertise that, make the community know, like let Accessibility Chicago, Accessibility New York. So as Dennis mentioned, I do the New York meetup. There's meetups like this all over the US and now the world. I mean, hopefully, I think as a grassroots community, really evangelizing the things that do accessibility well and using them on our own projects, that's one way we can strengthen them, and support them.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks to our presenter, Thomas Logan. Thanks to our venue host, Critical Mass. Visit them online at www.criticalmass.com. Thanks to all that donated to cover the costs of captioning. Thanks to our captioning sponsor, Genesis Solutions. Visit them online at www.genesis-solutions.com. Captions by Alternative Communication Services. Visit them online at acscaptions.com. Video recording and editing by Dennis Deacon. This recording has been brought to you by the Chicago Digital Accessibility and Inclusive Design Meetup. Visit us online at meetup.com/A11YCHI. Follow us on Twitter at twitter.com/A11YCHI. Follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/A11YCHI. Follow us on LinkedIn at linkedin.com/groups/8463995.